All right, welcome everyone to another edition of Federalist Radio Hour. I'm Emily Jashinsky, culture editor here at The Federalist. As always, you can shoot an email over to the show at radio@thefederalist.com. I'm really excited to be joined this morning by Chuck Rocha. Chuck is the president of Solidarity Strategies. He was a senior advisor to the Bernie Sanders presidential campaign in 2020. He's also the author of a great book, Tio Bernie, which you can buy at tioberniebook.com. Chuck, thanks so much for joining us this morning.
Hey, what's happening? Trying to figure out where the book is. The book is here. Look at that. I'm like Vanna White.
Yeah, you are. You're a great Vanna White, by the way. Something that Chuck and I were just talking about before going to air is Chuck asked me if I knew the Randy Travis song, I Told You So. That really is the song of the year for Chuck, because he was out there sounding the alarm about the Latino vote before the presidential election, and the way perhaps the Democratic establishment took Latino voters for granted. So Chuck, my first question right off the bat for you, as there's so much chatter in the media and among Beltway types about what happened with the Latino vote in Senate races and in the presidential race, could you just explain to us what you think did happen with Latino voters on Tuesday?
Yeah, and I think that it proved one thing. It's like Latinos have sat back for the last 5 months and saw white people talk about Latinos as a non-monolith, and Latinos were just sitting back waiting for election day going, wait, I got something to show y'all. You want to see we're not a monolith? Watch this shit. So that's what we did. And in Miami-Dade and in the Texas Valley, it was just much different than the other parts of the country. But if I was to break it down for your listeners, I would do it in this way. And that is, Joe Biden spent a lot of money talking to Latinos. He spent more money than Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden talking to Latinos. The problem is there really wasn't nobody else talking to Latinos other than some underfunded groups on the ground that are doing amazing work. Were the only ones really talking to Latinos. So that really wasn't happening at the national Biden super PAC level. It wasn't happening at the congressional level or the Senate level. And in states where there wasn't a presidential election, like in Texas, you saw a big difference in the way that Latinos acted. And as I dug through the numbers, there's a few things that really jump out at me. Let's start in Florida, where people want to say Latinos underperformed and Latinos this. Well, let's be clear about the way the Latino vote happened in Miami-Dade. Did Biden underperform in Miami-Dade compared to Hillary Clinton? Absolutely. But let's be clear. If Joe Biden would have performed at the same levels as Hillary Clinton, he still would have lost, but because of white people, because he underperformed with old white people in Florida and college-educated whites. So don't lay this on the feet of the Latinos who actually won the entire state for Joe Biden at near the rates that he should have. No, but let's not, I kind of get aggravated when folks are like, Chuck, what's wrong with the Latino vote? Well, we won the state for Joe Biden in our vote, but white people still love Donald Trump. This is just breaking news coming in. And in Texas, we talk about 3 or 4 counties in the valley where Donald Trump did really well, but there was no operation from really either campaign. And those counties only make up 15% of the total Latino population. If you look in precincts that I've dug into in Dallas and in Houston, where Latinos are 90% of the vote in that one precinct, Joe Biden won those precincts by 80%. So you got to really separate out when I talk about cultural competencies, Latinos in the Valley compared to Latinos in the city, compared to Cubans who were Republicans in Miami, to Puerto Ricans who overwhelmingly voted for Joe Biden in Orlando. That means that did we do okay? We did okay. And we did good as far as Joe Biden does, because he won Arizona by dramatic numbers with Latinos. Nuestro PAC, my super PAC, did amazing work in Arizona, Michigan, Pennsylvania this morning, where our PAC was the only Latino PAC talking to Latinos. So because of that, we cobbled together enough to actually win this thing at the presidential. But what you saw below that is very, very alarming. The national super PACs for Democrats spent $1 billion trying to persuade white people to vote for Joe Biden. In the same time period, they only spent about $25 million giving to Latino super PACs. And they want to look at us and say, why do we not perform, or we underperform, when only 2% of all of that big money actually went to Latino orgs? The second point is these congressional and House races. It's going to be written in history, and this is really bad, that half of all the congressional seats that were lost on election day were in districts where Latinos make up more than 40% of the overall population. That's a disturbing trend and something that we really need to figure out and do a real autopsy on.
So why do you think some of those trends are? I mean, we hear so much lip service from especially the Democratic establishment to Latino voters. So why do you think that some of these, as you say, alarming trends cropped up in 2020? What do Democrats not get about Latino outreach?
I did some research after the election because it was really astonishing to me, and I wanted to come up with some answers for people like you that would ask me these questions. And I wanted to say it's not just one thing, but it's a number of things. And it starts with Latinos actually not being a part of the conversation at the strategic level in these committees, on these campaigns, and more dramatically with the consultants. Voters don't want to hear, but consultants like me are the ones who actually run a campaign. If you're going to pay me millions of dollars to make TV commercials and radio ads and mail pieces, I'm literally the one running the campaign. It's not the field director, right? So I went and looked at all the top U.S. Senate races this year in 2020 and found out that not one single candidate or incumbent had a Latino or a Latina as a manager of their race. So there's no Latino campaign managers in America for any governor's race, Senate race. And then I even went to look at the top 30 congressional races, and there wasn't one single, well, I take that back. There was one out of 30 managers at every congressional race. And then I took another deeper dive to the consultants, the TV consultants, the mail consultants, the digital consultants. These are where the real money's made and where the real decisions and strategic prowess lies in the campaign. And again, there were no Latino-owned firms doing work anywhere. When I finally got to the congressional level, I would find one here, I would find one there, but I had to find a needle in a haystack. So I can safely say, of all of the campaigns that were run, Senate, governor, and House, 99% of all the managers and all the consultants was run by white women and white men. So if there's Latinos not at the table helping make making any of these decisions, then why would we think that we're going to be included in the strategy?
Is it frustrating to you as somebody who does this day in and day out and has been doing this day in and day out for years that you say that a lot of these campaigns were run by white men and white women, and the word that a lot of people would use for them would be woke white men and white women? They're people who believe that they have the right intentions and are, tackling all of these issues as best they can, but they really fundamentally don't understand it. That has to be frustrating on your end.
It is. And I talk about it all the time because I am a liberal. I am a leftist. When you talk about leftists, I am. But I also grew up in East Texas in a trailer house, and I know what government cheese tastes like. I killed my first deer when I was 12 years old. I've had a gun since I was 8. Like, I understand how the world works. Not because I killed a deer, I had a gun. It means I'm that Mexican redneck in that county in Texas that we're talking about. When these woke white consultants are sitting back saying, we need to figure out non-college educated brown men. Well, guess what the hell Chuck Rocha is? I ain't never been to college a day in my life. You can tell how I talk. So guess what? I'm pretty good at talking to other rednecks just like me. Why are you hiring a woke white boy from Harvard to figure out your Latino outreach? Because all they're doing is going back and saying, we should build an algorithm around the testing of this ad and figure out what the polling and the focus groups say about this, blah, 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 blah. And it's just asinine the way that this works. That's why I keep talking about the system being broke, because we've forgotten about the emotion in politics and we've made it too analytical. And especially with a demographic that's as diverse as Latinos, where they're considered white people, where they're considered black people, where they can't even figure out what we call each other. Are we Latino? Are we Latinx? Are we Hispanics? And we think a bunch of woke white consultants are going to figure that out for us. I think Tuesday night proved us differently.
Can we talk about the Latinx designation for just a moment? Because
you got to run right over there and grab the third rail. Go ahead, girl. I'm with you.
I mean, I've seen polling of Latino voters who say they've never even heard of the term. And if they have heard of the term, it's not their preferred term. And yet it's so popular among the Beltway class, the journalist class. I'm curious from your perspective as to whether it's whether it's the designation that people should be using, and why there does seem to be a gulf between the media class and, actual Latino voters.
Look, Latinx is a word that's non-gender binding. And for a lot of young, woke, brown Latinos, that's what they want to use because they don't want this hierarchy of male-dominated Latin, which says everybody is a Latino. Why does a woman and a group of women need to be a group of Latinos when they're a group of Latinas? So I've been watching this and sitting back and watching this. And again, I said I never went to college. I'm not a Rhodes Scholar. I don't even understand what Latin is. But I do know this. If that's the way you want to be determined, if you want to tell me your pronoun, you want to use Latinx, out of respect for you, because I'm a lefty, I'm going to return that. And that's how I'm going to refer to you. But when it comes to just regular Latinos, the older demographic, as you say, they have no idea what Latinx is, right? They have no idea, some of them, what Latino is. They are Hispanics because of where they're from. In New Mexico, they like to be called Hispanics because the Latinos there, most of which up north, all came from Spain in the original Spanish land grant. So they're like, we are Hispanics. And down in Florida, it's different. So you're never going to get right on this issue other than people trying to conform or use conformity to try to show respect to a demographic that sometimes you may turn off if you're an older Latino because they don't even know what that is. So that's the way I handle it. And just because I use Latino all the time because I feel like that's how I self-identify and I'm fine with using that. And so when I write as Latino. I find that a lot of times, though, when I'm dealing with these woke white consultants or the left media, they use the word Latinx. And I know what they're doing is because their audience is lefties and their audience wants to be gender compliant or gender neutral. And I respect that. If that's the term you want to use, it don't turn me off. But the thing that I worry about sometimes is when we use it in communications, in mail, and advertisements to older Latinos who may really not know what that is.
And what we're getting at right here is something that you talk about all the time and you have, which is the kind of myth of the Latino monolith. And I know that's a huge subject, but for some of our listeners, would you be able to break that down and explain how Latino voters in Texas and New Mexico and Florida and Pennsylvania, how you have to approach them differently as voters and, culturally, what those differences are?
Let me start by saying what drives us together. There's three things that all Latinos have in common, but in different ways. That's food, music, and our families. The interesting thing is our food is different, our language is different, and our music is different. So you can't show up in Miami where it's 75% Cuban and start playing mariachi music. For all you white people out there, mariachis didn't come from Cuba or that's a Mexican thing. It's very Texas. It's very California and Arizona. It's a Mexican thing. And just so you wonder where Mexicans fit in this totality, 68% of all the Latinos in America are Mexican. So if you just defer to something and you do Mexican and you're not in Florida, you normally can get away with it. But let's talk about just Florida. In just that one state, you have Miami that's dominated by Cubans. But then you've had this growth of Venezuelans coming in. Nicaraguans, you've had all of these other countries, Colombians coming in to Miami. And then 4 hours up the road, you have Orlando, Kissimmee, and Tampa, where you have this Puerto Rican population. Now, both of those are Caribbean Latinos from islands in the Caribbean, but they couldn't be more different culturally, even though their islands are literally 100 miles from each other. Cubans supported Donald Trump at almost 58%, while 4 hours up the road, these Puerto Ricans only supported Donald Trump at 21%. So they were literally polar opposites when it comes to voting, even though they're on the voter file, they're both Latino. They both live in Florida. They both live 3 hours from each other in Florida. They both speak Spanish, even though their Spanishes are a little different. That's just a nuance. And to add a little more flavor to that, in the same state, if you go to Tampa, there was a bunch of farm workers that moved there 25 years ago because of the tomatoes and other things that are grown there. And now their children are all U.S. citizens and coming up there. So there's this emerging big population of Mexicans who look at the world even more differently. Now they vote more like Puerto Ricans because they support Democrats. In this last election in 2020, 75% of Latinos supported Joe Biden at 75%. And as you go west, it's Mexicans in Texas, it's Mexicans in Arizona, it's Mexicans and Puerto Ricans in California. But they culturally are different because of the politics there. A Mexican in East LA is going to be a lot more liberal because he's part of La Raza, and that's where the movement was back in the day, than a Mexican redneck like Chuck Rocha, who's from Tyler, Texas, who grew up in a trailer house, who wears a funny cowboy hat most of the time, who got cowboy boots. Like, I look at the world and grew up in a conservative Bible Belt area where I wasn't Catholic when I was a young man. I grew up in a Baptist church, was saved when I was 8, got baptized when I was 11, know all the New Testament, right? That blows people's mind, not just because they've seen me drink a lot of whiskey, but because I grew up in a Baptist church, and it kind of shocks them sometimes.
Yeah, this is also interesting. There's a lot of discussion on the right now about, for instance, the Cuban population or the Nicaraguans who have come in, or Venezuelans who have come into the country in, maybe the last decade. And there's a lot of discussion that perhaps it was Donald Trump's really strong stand against what he referred to as socialism, and perhaps tying Joe Biden to socialism, that brought a higher proportion of Cubans or Venezuelans into the fold. I'm wondering what your take on that is. Do you think that it was really the socialism being used as a wedge issue that allowed Republicans to make inroads with Cuban voters? I mean, they already had inroads with Cuban voters, but Cuban voters, Venezuelans. Do you think that actually was a successful messaging?
Yes and no. There's just not too many pure yes and no answers in politics. I would tell you this, that the people that really are bothered by socialism and communism wording in Miami are Cubans who are already registered as Republicans, and they are just not persuadable voters. They're going to vote for any Republican no matter what you say. And so that's the misnomer there. But the thing that they did do is that, and let me say that Barack Obama and Donald Trump's percentages of the Cuban vote was much not different on who supported and who didn't support. Donald Trump got about 58% of the Cuban vote, and so did the last Republican that ran down there. But what they did that was really smart is they started earlier courting the Cuban vote, right? And so they were growing the participation. And that's what you saw in Miami-Dade was literally more Latinos coming. The percentages were about the same, but you just had this big uptick in participation because Donald Trump spent a lot of money to get them out. So as I wrote about in my book, if you start early talking to Latinos and talking to them about the things that you want them to know about you, you have much more of a time to make an argument. So I think starting early, being very intentional. You notice that Donald Trump had all of these Cubans at the RNC convention speaking, telling their immigration story. Like that all matters because it's covered in the local papers in Miami every day. And the last piece of that is, as you think about that vote, you know, it's so much sporadic on who's born on the island and who's not born on the island. The younger Latinos tend to be more democratic. So I think that there was a lot of things done right and wrong. But one thing that's going underreported in what happened in Miami-Dade is it cost us 2 Democratic congressional seats that are majority Latino. Like this is the real story of Tuesday night.
And what was it with those seats? Was it the uptick in Cuban support for Donald Trump that impacted the down ballot races?
So the percentages didn't change that much on how many people supported McCain compared to Trump or Trump the last time. What's this difference is you have this uptick in turnout, right? And so what that did is it helped them beat Donna Shalala and Debbie Mercosur-Powell, who was running against a Cuban American who was the former mayor of Miami County. Right. So, and she's Central American. They're both Latino and Latina, but she got beat by Cuban. And the other thing, digging into some numbers, Debbie got beat by, and she spent $6 million and the Republican Cuban only spent 1.5.
That is very interesting. Do you think there's any truth to the theory that Venezuelans are persuadable by Republicans who are able to tie Democrats to socialism? Is it just Cubans that's really a powerful message with, or do you think the Venezuelan voters are persuadable with that as well?
It's a great question, Emily. And the numbers do show that the socialism thing does work with the Venezuelans, but they're really not a persuadable universe. They come here much like the Cubans, already kind of baked in that they're going to be Republicans. There's not as many of them, not even a quarter as many of them as there are Cubans. So it's just one of those one-off nuances that you should go have a conversation with them. And what you'll see as the Venezuelans are more here and here longer, that they'll be easier to persuade the longer that they're here. But freshly coming off a boat, getting off a plane, living what they live through, like it's very raw emotion for them. And I think that's why it worked so well this election for them.
Now, you're a Texas guy. Someone we both know, Sagar and Jetty, has been highlighting the vote in some heavily Hispanic counties in Texas that went surprisingly had some surprising numbers for President Trump. What do you think happened there? Do you think that was genuinely that this is genuinely a product of higher Hispanic support for Donald Trump, or is there something else going on there that we're missing?
I think we're missing a few things there. One is Sagar is talking about these 4 counties along the Texas border, and they overwhelmingly supported Donald Trump way more than they had ever supported any Republican in these rural Texas counties along the valley. But you should keep in mind that this is just 15% of the Latino vote down there. The bulk of the Latino vote actually lives in the inner cities of Dallas and Houston and San Antonio. And if you look at the precincts in Dallas, where let's say the precinct is 95% Latino, Donald Trump was winning those, Joe Biden was winning those at 70 and 75%. So even in the same states this is a great point to what we were just talking about, Emily. In the same state, you had Latinos overwhelmingly supporting Donald Trump in the Valley. And then 6 hours away, the same Mexicans, maybe in the same family in Dallas, Texas, are supporting Joe Biden at almost 75%. So they like to highlight those small counties, and they being the media and the Republicans, of the inroads that Donald Trump made in these rural counties. Well, guess what? Again, in rural counties, ain't nobody talking to them. They haven't heard from a Democrat in a while. But up in Dallas County, there's infrastructure. There's a city and a state party that's doing a lot of work. And so that's how you can really see the nuances of how indifferent the demographic is, even in one state.
So Republicans definitely have, under Donald Trump, focused more heavily on outreach to minority voters, particularly Black voters and Hispanic voters. Do you think there's any, I guess I'm trying to ask what you think Republicans misunderstand, and you could probably write a full book about that. But what do you think are a few of the sort of top line things that Republicans get wrong when they reach out to Latino voters?
Well, I mean, I think a lot of this, people, I want to argue about the messaging. And I like to say that part of that is just making the outreach, which is, I think, the positive things that Republicans are doing. Like, they don't take for granted that we're not a persuadable universe. So they go down and fight for the Cuban vote. They fight for the Venezuelan vote. And they use, the problem is they only use this socialism and communism in a negative thing. The thing that they do wrong is they have an opportunity where if they use positive messaging to Latinos about growth and about small business and about aspirations to become rich and to become powerful and all the things that Latinos want to do because it helps them provide better for their family. I think they could cut even deeper into the Latino sector that the Democrats get if they had a more economic populist message that went along with their rhetoric. Like, we all have rhetoric. Like, I say Donald Trump's building a wall and he hates Mexicans, and he does. But then I say, and Joe Biden will do this, and will raise the minimum wage, and will help small businesses, and will help us recover from COVID. You never hear that pivot from Republicans to that economic populism. Keep in mind, a lot of Latinos, especially Latino men, are like me, non-college educated, had to work several jobs to make it. And we want to know, is there a path for us to success? And I think Republicans could maximize that if they use that economic populism more.
That raises the issue to me, which is, I think the American dream, the concept of the American dream, is something that may be dying among white voters, particularly in some of these like places that are being hit so hard by what are referred to as deaths of despair, by the opioid crisis, by, shuttered factories and everything else. But it does seem like with minority voters, the American dream is still something that is very much something they aspire to. And I don't mean to generalize and talk about minority voters as this
Sure.
general block, but I think that that's an important dynamic, that they want to, they came to this country, Hispanics came to this country, and they want to succeed, and they want to provide for their families and have a higher level of living.
Let me back you up there. In the primary, I ran the super successful Latino outreach for Bernie Sanders as part of the overall operation of the campaign. And people asked me, what was the winning message? Well, I said, it's not the message. It's going and having the conversation and then giving them the message that was really winning from Bernie Sanders. But let me say this, and that is, Latinos really, really reacted to this fixed or rigged system. And that was the messaging that we used. Back to your point, they aspire to be great. They aspire to be rich, but they feel like the system is a little rigged against them. And so that messaging that Donald Trump has of fighting the system, of him being an outsider, of, it's rigged against people, like that worked for Bernie Sanders. But you also saw Donald Trump using that rhetoric as well. And he should have used it more, because Latino men specifically think that the system is rigged. And they loved when they loved when Bernie Sanders talked about the system being rigged, kind of like there's two Americas, going back to the old John Edwards slogan. But that's something that really resonates with Latinos, is this rigged system of unfairness if you're not rich and powerful.
Why is that? Is it because speaks to their experience in so many communities?
Because they're normally working, they're at the lower end of the economic scale, so they're having to do more to make it. And at every turn, it seems like something is rigged against them. Healthcare is going up. The minimum wage in Texas is $7 an hour, but over in the other state, it's $15 an hour. Like they just see that this class and race thing is over affecting them. And because the Democrats really have never talked to a lot of these infrequent or non-frequent Latino voters, they don't really even know why the Democrats are with them. So they're not wed to anybody. That's your problem in the Texas Valley that you just described with Trump overperforming. The ones who did participate was like, I think they're all crooks. At least this guy's not part of the system. And maybe and he's rich. Maybe he'll help me get rich. So I ain't got to work 3 jobs. I can just work 2 jobs.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. There's such an interesting dynamic where the left has really spent 5 years now calling Donald Trump racist and, saying that he's a racist against, just about every minority voting bloc that there is, and that he's the wall is well part of this, et cetera, et cetera. And it's just really interesting to me that as that's happened over the course of 5 years, and particularly his first term in office, he ended up with a higher proportion of the Hispanic vote from these numbers that we've had a few days now to sort of chew over. Why do you think that is? It's so interesting to me that the entire media could be saying one thing about Donald Trump, and clearly that was rejected by, some proportion of particularly Hispanic voters.
Well, let me clarify a couple things. And I think you're right on most of the things you're saying, but it needs to be explained. One is you have to take Florida, you have to saw it off the map and you set it over there to the side, and we'll come back to Florida. But outside of Florida, in all the other states where we ran this election, Joe Biden's going to get 70% of the Latino vote. That's as good as Hillary and good as Barack Obama, right? My argument to Democrats is we get so happy about getting 65% or 70% or 68. We'll be between 65 and 70 in all these states. When if you do this the right way, and you could go get 90% of Latinos like you do African Americans if you were doing this in the right way. So Joe Biden does really good. And Latinos will have given him the presidency because of Nevada, Arizona, Pennsylvania, and Michigan, right? Because there's a lot of Latinos in all those places, right? But the key to what you're talking about is the Republicans wisely know that they can go to Florida and they can skim off a bunch of votes because of Cubans, because there are just so many more conservative Republicans there. But here's the big kicker for you. In Florida, of the 591,000 newly registered Latinos since Donald Trump has been the president, 591,000. The majority of those Latinos registered as no party preference. And what that tells me is a pattern that I've seen all across the country is that these young Latinos coming of age are not wed to any party, and they are up for grabs. And neither party is really making that effort. But because they get to see, they know who Joe Biden is, or they know who Donald Trump is, more so Donald Trump, you start seeing them get sectioned off little by little by little. Let's talk about Georgia. I just ran the numbers and I'm writing a budget for Georgia right now to weigh in on these 2 Georgia runoff seats. There's 160,000 Latinos who have registered to vote in Georgia since Donald Trump has been the president. And they've all predominantly registered as no party preference, right? Like I'm going to go start talking to them about John Ossoff and Warnock, right? If I get enough money or somebody gives me some money to go talk to them, I want to have my budget ready to roll. So the point is America is changing in the way. These old Mexicans like me, we're Democrats. We're going to vote for any Democrat. That's who we are. But there's not as many of me. The average age of a Latino in America is 27. They are all this younger demographic who's looking for a reason to be a Democrat and wants to know why they're being told they're not a Republican.
One thing I've been thinking a lot about in recent days is in the aftermath of the 2016 election, Dean Baquet, who is the executive editor of the New York Times, said, we don't get religion. And I know that's somebody from their sort of perch in the media, but I think that also applies to the Democratic Party. And it wasn't always that way. This is something that I think is a newer struggle for Democrats. And I'm curious, Chuck, from your vantage point, and especially as a leftist who spent time on the Bernie Sanders campaign and has a message certainly of economic populism and sort of unabashed leftism across the board. Why do Democrats struggle? Or maybe my premise is wrong. Do Democrats struggle to communicate with religious voters, particularly Christian voters?
I think they have. I grew up as a Southern Baptist in East Texas. I just told you my lineage of going to church and understanding Southern Baptist because I was one, just like I'm a non-college educated brown man. Let's talk about the Latino demographic, though, in particular. People are like, Latinos are staunch Catholics and blah, blah, blah. And part of that is true, especially our mothers and our grandmothers, right? And especially if you're Mexican. Well, if you're Cuban for that matter too, all Latinos predominantly are Catholic. But what you see is just like you see in young people, I just told you the average age of a Latino. Religion is really, really important and a driving decision for many older Latinos, right? So that's where you see a big change. Is it not as important as younger Latinos? You don't see younger Latinos using religion as a reason why they would support or not support, where you may see an older grandmother who's very religious, who goes to church all the time, who has faith beads, like all the things that shows up every time the door's open, grandma's there. Like that's a different demographic. So understanding that makes it even that much more worse about Democrats dealing with the religion issue. We're talking about Democrats and Republicans both not figuring out the Latino vote. So if Democrats have a problem talking about religion overall, you can imagine the way you would have to nuance it within the Latino community and within language. The last thing I'll say is those older Latinos who are way more religious also are more prominent Spanish speakers. And they're also more prone to get disinformation like you saw happening in Miami-Dade with all of this disinformation and wrong information campaigns that was directly targeted at Spanish-speaking Latinos down there.
Can you talk a little bit about your work in Pennsylvania? Because as we're speaking right now, you're being kind of vindicated as some of these votes are being tallied literally as we're speaking right now. Talk a little bit about what you did there.
I was so honored to be able to run Nuestro PAC. We created a PAC right after Bernie Sanders' campaign to continue the work of trying to get Latinos out. So we got funding, and we were the only Latino organization out there working in Pennsylvania, working in Michigan, one of several groups working in Arizona and Nevada. Does this sound familiar to you? What did we do? Oh my God, we won all of those states. Well, guess what else we did? I made sure when we were targeting these Latinos to go talk to them, we targeted these newly registered Latinos that nobody was talking to. We targeted Latinos who had an infrequent voting history. We took out the crazy Republicans. We took out all the crazy lefty Democrats like me. We were going to vote anyway. And we really concentrated on this sweet spot of persuadable Latinos. And this morning I tweeted out, you can go thank a Latino for winning Pennsylvania for Joe Biden. When it happens, we targeted 98,000, mainly in the eastern part of Pennsylvania, persuadable, mainly Puerto Rican voters who we talked to not the last week, not the last 3 weeks, Democrats, but for 4 months we talked to them and spent $2 million. Like I did it the way that I showed folks you could do it with Bernie Sanders. And I did the same thing there. And I did it with a team of people. It wasn't me by myself, but we raised the money. We went and did it. And by God, we delivered the state. Latinos should be credited when Joe Biden or if Joe Biden wins Pennsylvania for delivering that. If you look at that map and everything from Scranton all the way down to Philadelphia, that's blue, ain't because of union workers. It's because Puerto Ricans have moved there in droves from the island, and we had an operation to get them out to vote.
My last question for you, Chuck, and your expertise goes beyond Latino voters, and certainly that's your expertise as well. But you were a union leader. You came up through the ranks of union work, and I want to ask how you think Democrats, or as we sort of are looking at maybe the end of the Trump era in the Republican Party, where Republicans were suddenly, able to flip some really, long-time Democratic strongholds that with the white working class. What do you think the future is for Democrats in terms of outreach to the white working class? Do you think this is an uphill battle because of Trump's sort of makeover of the Republican Party? Or do you think this appeal for the Republicans won't be able to outlast Trump himself, who is a very singular figure?
If Democrats want to win any more elections, they're going to have to figure out these white union members, and they're going to figure out Latinos. I just happen to have been both of those things. These non-college educated white men, they want somebody who's going to fix the economy. Somebody's going to put people back to work. Donald Trump brilliantly used all that messaging to get elected the first time. There was just enough people this time who believed that he was trying to sell them false narrative that didn't show up this time, where he barely lost. But we have to figure this out. And we're just doing it the wrong way. White super PAC spent $1 billion to go talk to these folks. But again, they went and spent $1 billion with a bunch of white woke consultants from Harvard to go figure out a bunch of white guys who talk like me, who work with their hands, who understand what these calluses are that are on my hands, right? So unless you hire some folks with some calluses, these guys that use moisturizer on their hand ain't never going to figure out how to go talk to no steel worker like me. So you've got to go to the community and figure out the messaging. And it's an economic populist message about you're being screwed because you don't have a voice. and you're being screwed because they're shipping your jobs overseas. Like, we have to go meet these white workers just like you need to with Latinos. This ain't rocket science, but this is the reckoning I think that's going to happen in the way that we do things differently, because we lost enough House and Senate races this year to where there's a bunch of donors who felt like these consultants just took all their money, lit it on fire, and threw it off buildings in Miami.
And I think that to some extent is what actually happened. I have one follow-up to that, which is you say the economic populist message, and I agree with that. And I'm from Wisconsin, and I remember when Randy Bryce was sort of the hot new thing on the scene. And I'm thinking, I definitely think that the messaging of economic populism is strong, but I'm curious if the policies of economic populism are strong too, because I think there's some sort of, it's a challenge to sell Medicare for all, is a challenge to sell some of those, free public college, whatever it is. But there is an argument that's made by Jason Kander and some other folks on the left that if you're sort of bold about this economic populist policies, you will be able to draw people in because that's what the white working class wants to hear. They too feel the system is rigged. Do you think the actual policies of leftist economic populism are the solution to bringing some of these voters back into the party?
We've clearly discussed it. I'm not a college graduate, so I'm not going to debate people on policy. I'm the message guy. You want to hire somebody to win a campaign? I can do it. Can we start with just going and talking about bringing jobs back? Can we go and talk about making the field level for working class Americans? That's what we want to hear. And then they'll believe Donald Trump has proven. They will believe you. And then if you'll try to do something when you're in Congress to give them something, it may not be perfect. Maybe it's not Medicare for all, but if it's showing more access to more health care, at least showing that you care, that guy's working every day to provide for his family. He don't mind paying some taxes. He don't want to pay 60% taxes, but he also don't want to get ripped off when GE or Amazon is paying no taxes. Like, these are the argument that Bernie had down that were really right. And this is what people really don't understand, is it works with brown men as well. It works really well with them. And we don't want to admit that.
Yeah, and it's such an interesting place to end it, because there is so much overlap between,
let me say this, Emily. When I say men and men and men, it's because men are voting the wrong way. The reason I don't mention women is because they're smarter than men. And they're already voting the right way. Latinas delivered this election, right? The men were the dumbasses.
Well, that's usually how it is. Chuck Rocha, thank you so much for your time this morning. Chuck is the president of Solidarity Strategies. He is the author of Tio Bernie, which you can get at tioberniebook.com. He's a senior advisor in the Bernie Sanders 2020 campaign. You can follow him on social media. He's a great follow. Highly recommend you check out his feed. Chuck, thank you so much for your time.
Y'all be good.
This has been another edition of the Federalist Radio Hour. I'm Emily Jashinsky. We'll be back soon with more. Until then, be lovers of freedom and anxious for the fray.